Hey everybody, welcome back to Jeff Bowles Central. We're going to be doing a retro roundup for you today. This is Final Fantasy IX, the PlayStation 1 classic, I think. Of course, Final Fantasy has a very, very long history, going back to the original Nintendo Entertainment System, and as we all know, Final Fantasy VII broke the mold because, well, Square decided to port, or I guess translate, probably the biggest money-making franchise that they had at the time to Sony's console. And the reasons for that also go back quite a way, but we'll leave that aside. Now, the original PlayStation had three primary Final Fantasies come out on the system. Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, and this guy right here, Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy VII is considered by, I would say, most long-term Final Fantasy fans as the single shining example of what a beautiful Japanese role-playing game looked like at the era. A lot of people still consider it the best Final Fantasy game ever made. I don't know how I feel about that. I love that game, don't get me wrong, it's an absolute masterpiece, it was an absolute classic. There is nothing at all wrong with Final Fantasy VII. But I think that enough games have come out in the series since then to probably usurp the best of moniker. Final Fantasy XII was also very good. Final Fantasy XIII and XIV were also very good. Final Fantasy X and X-2 were very good. Regardless, what nobody really wants to, put their name in the hat in as far as what the best game in the original PlayStation trilogy was Final Fantasy VIII. Everybody hates Final Fantasy VIII. I'm not a big fan of Final Fantasy VIII. The thing that happened with Final Fantasy VIII is, number one, the story was kind of muddled, and it wasn't that compelling. But also the actual gameplay was just really, really, really complex. And I think even Square understood that, because when it came finally time to release Final Fantasy IX here, they stripped out all the junk from Final Fantasy VIII. All the materia caching, and all the this and the that, and trying to summon beasts and all that stuff that was really, really complicated, that kind of didn't need to be. They pulled it out with Final Fantasy IX. And the other thing about Final Fantasy IX, as you can kind of see here, the art style is very distinct. It's much more like those original NES Final Fantasy games. It's cutesy. I will say that. I will admit that it's cutesy, but it's also fantasy. The thing about the Final Fantasy series, as it was originally conceived, was that it was like fantasy, like traditional fantasy, what you would think of, like Lord of the Rings, right? That kind of fantasy, or even like Game of Thrones, if we're going to jump into the future. That kind of fantasy. And so I love Final Fantasy IX for that reason. I love that it's a return back to the classic sort of fantasy vibe. And I love the story. I love the characters. I love Zidane, even though we got a game over here. Game over. I love Zidane. I love Steiner. I love Vivi. Yeah, the little black mage guy. He's great. And what's really noticeable about this game is when you first boot it up, the story starts immediately. And the fighting starts immediately, although it's kind of like a slow ramp-up thing where the fights don't really have any big bearing on the actual, final proceedings of everything. But as the story develops, it's fun, and it's a beautiful game. It's regardless of where you fall down on of those original three PlayStation Final Fantasies, which is the best, and it probably is Final Fantasy VII. I'm not going to say it's not. But as far as just the actual quality of the graphics, we're looking at the HD remaster here, so it looks even better than it did back in the day. But just the quality of graphics, I mean, it's a great looking game. It's a wonderful looking game, and it's, the random battle encounters still kind of suck. I'm not going to lie about that. I still hate random battle encounters, and I'm so glad they don't exist anymore. Even though the HD remaster has a safe mode where you can like walk around without that happening, but as you know, you do that, you don't level, therefore you don't really get very far in the game. But just with the setting and the fact that they stripped out all the gunk, I feel, all the gunk from Final Fantasy VIII. And some of the stuff that was in Final Fantasy VII too, even though, you know, it was much simpler. And the strength of the story, and the strength of the characters, and the art direction, and everything. I think Final Fantasy IX is a great game. It is totally, by the way, a retro classic. If you've never played this game before, you kind of owe it to yourself to give it a shot, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. You know, they don't make games like this anymore. They just don't. And, you know, part of that is kind of beneficial, but part of it's not, because, you know, it's quaint, but it's, for its time, it was a beautiful masterpiece of a game. So that's it! Final Fantasy IX Retro Roundup! That's all I got! Do me a favor, everybody, and buy this book from me, Godly and Other Paint Stories. It's my first short story collection. I've got 3 now, but this is probably the best one. I'll be honest about that. Anyway, buy it!